we were speaking about books there, guys, and I was saying that my grandson is about to leave nursery to go into primary school after the summer, but the school's already been in contact with him to give him his app so he gets his homework and he can do it all online before he even started the school. I mean, I just can't get my head around this.
What is the age 5?
I've got one who was showing me how to work one of his names, and he just prattled on and says, right, now, you try it. And I hadn't a clue what I had to do. Went right through it himself. I said, well, what are you doing? I was keying away and working away, and it was crazy. I gave up. I said, carry on. I'm going downstairs to watch TV.
I get my ear burnt by a middle grandchild who's in S1, and when she was at home, she diligently did all the work that school sent, as did the vast majority of the class, but 6 didn't do any work at home. So the teacher's now going over everything again for these 6, while the rest of the class sit and go slightly nuts.
Fred,
very, very
yeah, my neighbour's daughter said she's really not sure there's any point in going to school because they're just going over what they all did while they were shut down online. And I'm not sure whether that. I think that's a pretty bad thing, actually.
Well, my wife, who's a former primary teacher, doesn't understand it, of course, because it's in groups. And I thought Bruce at the secondary school they could have got round that.
David lost all contact with secondary schooling. I have no idea what they're doing.
At the moment, the biggest, both my son's a secondary school teacher, and at the moment they're absolutely inundated with trying to do this assessment stuff. And again, one of the problems there is a bunch of the children haven't done anything while they've been locked down, so there's nothing to assess. And a bunch of the children have done stuff, but they're actually constrained by what grade they can give against some previous level of, against their original, before lockdown, whatever grade they were predicting for the child, you're not allowed to give them lower than that. And he's not quite sure how, if you've got no work to assess, you can justify saying somebody's got, say, a grade A when they've actually done nothing. On the other hand, you're not allowed to give any grades without explaining what work backs that up. And yet you're constrained to give a grade that, the council's got a problem, I think, in terms of logical predictions. Whatever happens, it's going to end up with a nightmare like last year, where everybody complains that the grades they've been given, especially if they've got low grades, aren't fair. It's a nightmare.
It's almost impossible to devise a fair system, particularly for the kids that have done nothing during lockdown. There's some of them just gone home, just forgotten about schoolwork, and they deserve to get poor grades, frankly, but they're not going to. They're going to get...
Yeah, unfortunately, not all of them have done nothing because some of them weren't able to do much for various reasons. So, that's another conundrum. It's all very well saying that one teacher's got to look at, 40, 50 children and come up with a fair grade for all of them. But I don't envy anybody who's trying to set exam results, but it sounds like a complete nightmare with no reasonable solution without actually running exams.
It's meant to be a certificate of demonstrated attainment, and if the attainment has not been demonstrated, then the certificate shouldn't be issued. It's really up to the universities and colleges to say that we don't expect you to have the kind of attainment that we would have expected in previous years. It shouldn't be up to SQA to give you a certificate on what you might have got if you had done the work, but of course you haven't done the work. So
I suppose it might be at the end of the day, but at the moment, the teachers who maybe should be bringing children who've fallen behind up to speed are struggling with actually assessing the ones that need to be assessed at the moment. It's surmountable, I suppose, but it's a nightmare.
Anyway, it's good to have you here this morning. I'm looking forward to your subject matter, and I think you're going to follow, or during it, you'll give us a scintillating conversation talk about what the subject matter consists of, mainly about wives and divorcees and what have we, beheadings. So, Roy, if you would like to start, you can take the floor.
Thank you, gentlemen. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you today. The story of Henry VIII and his 6 wives is hardly ever told from Henry's point of view. So I'm going to address that today. I want you to imagine that I'm a reincarnation of Henry, and I'm going to tell you the true story of his marriages. Apart from a few jokes that I throw in, this is all historically based. It's all factual, but I view the historical facts from Henry's point of view. So without more ado, I'd like to introduce to you King Henry VIII. Gentlemen, good morrow. Thank you heartily for your attendance upon me today. My name is Henry Tudor. I am, or I was, King Henry VIII of England. I died in 1547. But I've come back to the world, as you can see, in a completely different human form because I'm outraged. I'm beside myself with fury about how you remember me. You remember me only because I had 6 wives, 2 of whom lost their heads at the Tower of London. So what if I had 6 wives? I was a wonderful husband. I was just unlucky with some of my wives. I will tell you the true story of my marriages today, but I will also tell you why I deserve to be remembered as King Henry VIII, the greatest king England ever had. Now I will anticipate some of your questions. How am I coping with the modern world? I am in terror of everything in the modern world. My guards have to accompany me everywhere. But you may remember from your history books about me that I was interested in learning. I was always interested in new learning, new science. And I will have you know that I have one of these devices. You probably also have one. This is called an Apple smartphone. And when one of my guards telephones the number of my smartphone, it has a bell which rings. And if I hold this to my ear, I can hear what my guards are saying, even though there may be hundreds of miles away. And how much easier life would have been for me in 16th century England, gentlemen, if I had had one of these devices. For example, on the day that Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London, I had to arrange for loud cannons to be fired so that I would know that she was dead and so that I could enjoy the rest of the day and have a particularly good dinner. Gentlemen, you need to understand 2 things about me and my marriages. I had to have a healthy male heir. It was a mania with me. England had had 30 years of civil war with the Wars of the Roses. And when I died, I wanted the Tudor dynasty to continue. And I deserve credit for that, if you please. I had to have a male heir, a healthy boy to continue the dynasty. And your historians are correct when they say that I would sweep aside without mercy anyone who stood in my way. It was more important to me than women, more important than marriage, more important than the wealth of my kingdom, even more important than defeating the French in battle. I had to have a male heir. Now, the second matter is one which many of your historians have forgotten. God. I spent my life trying to understand what God wanted me to do. And I was terrified that on my death, my immortal soul would go to hell if I did not do God's bidding while I was on earth. And as you probably know, I found it very difficult at times to understand what God wanted me to do, why he was punishing me, for example, by failing to give me a healthy male heir. And once again, I would sweep aside without mercy anyone who stood in the way of my doing God's will. I come now to my first wife, Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. I first met her when I was 10 years of age because she had come to England to marry my elder brother, Arthur. I was never expected to be king. I never expected to be king. My brother Arthur was groomed as the Prince of Wales. And I liked Catherine very much, even at the age of 10. And she and Arthur were married, but poor Arthur died just 5 months after the marriage. I can still remember the day the messenger arrived from Wales. I had never seen my father weep before. I can still remember the lamentations of my mother. But over the next 8 years, Catherine and I fell in love. It was a love match. And when I became king in 1509, we were married. And we had a happy marriage for 18 years before things went wrong. Please may that be remembered. 18 years. Catherine became pregnant very quickly and gave birth to a boy, Henry. So already I thought I had fulfilled my ambition. But poor little Henry died after 7 weeks. Still, I thought there was enough time to produce a healthy male heir, plenty of time. Gentlemen, I have to laugh when I see Catherine of Aragon portrayed in that device you have in your houses called a television, and in those halls where you congregate called cinemas. She is shown as a devout woman clasping her hands in prayer, and yes, she was a very devout woman. But Catherine was passionate. She was a passionate blonde Latin woman. Catherine had enough passion inside her for 10 women. I sometimes used to enjoy being with my mistress, Elizabeth Blount, just to get a rest from Catherine. But after 18 years of marriage and many pregnancies, all that Catherine had produced was a girl, Mary. And much as I loved Mary, it was not enough. It was against God's will for women to have dominion over men. And Catherine, as a result of her pregnancies, had grown very, very fat. When she had no clothes on, I could hardly bear to look at her, let alone touch her. And I fell out of love with Catherine. I fell in love with one of her ladies in waiting, Anne Boleyn, of whom more very shortly. So I summoned my chancellor, my chief minister, you would call him Prime Minister Thomas Wolsey. And I told Wolsey he would have to find a way to annul my marriage to Catherine. I will call it a divorce. Because I thought God was punishing me by not giving me a male heir. You see, there are parts of the Bible which say that a man is not supposed to marry his brother's widow, and I thought God was punishing me. This became known as the King's Great Matter. I told Catherine why it was necessary for me to be divorced from her. But she infuriated me by defending the marriage. What she said was ingenious. She said that her first marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. Therefore, there was no impediment to my marrying her. It infuriated me at the time. But now that I am back in the world, knowing how devout Catherine was, I do not think she would have lied so many times before her God. So I think she was probably telling the truth. I knew from her ladies in waiting that there would be no more children. And I had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn. In fact, I was completely besotted, like madness, with Anne Boleyn. I realized after her downfall, of course, that she was a witch and had bewitched me, but I did not know at the time. She was the younger daughter of the Earl of Wiltshire and had spent many years abroad, first in a finishing school in the Netherlands, and then she'd spent 7 years at the French court. She was of the medium height. She was slim. Many men wondered what it was I saw in her, because her sister was much more voluptuous. Her sister Mary, I had an affair with Mary. I sired a daughter on Mary. But Anne Boleyn had a presence, a charm, and a grace. And we had much in common as regards music and intellectual matters and books and religion. After 2 years, Wolsey had failed to obtain the divorce. And I regarded that as treason on his part. I dismissed him as my chief minister. Eventually, he was arrested. Anne Boleyn hated him. She and her faction framed over 30 charges of treason against Wolsey. And he was on his way to the Tower of London to be beheaded when he died of natural causes. It used to infuriate me, gentlemen, when people cheated justice by dying before they could be executed. Although I loved Anne Boleyn, the English people did not. They used to hiss at her when she passed in the streets. They called her the king's goggle-eyed whore because she had quite prominent eyes. And I learned later that Wolsey used to refer to her as the night crow. And so I carried out one of the greatest events in English history, the Reformation. I broke with Rome, broke with the Pope, set myself up as supreme head of the Church of England in England, so that my Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, could grant the divorce so that I could marry Anne Boleyn. But it didn't quite happen in that order, because at last, after 6 years, Anne Boleyn surrendered to my lust for her, and she became pregnant. So we had to become married quickly. And thereafter, Thomas Cranmer granted the divorce. I still saw Catherine. I still had respect for Catherine. Catherine continued to make my shirts, gentlemen. She was a wonderful needlewoman. She could make beautiful shirts. But Anne Boleyn became furious at that and jealous. She tried to make my shirts herself. And gentlemen, I would not have been seen dead in any shirt made by Anne Boleyn. Well, I settled that argument by employing a professional seamstress who in future made my shirts. Anne Boleyn and Catherine, of course, hated each other. And because she was a witch and had bewitched me, Anne Boleyn forced me to do terrible things to Catherine. She forced me to take away the royal jewels from Catherine and give them to Anne. She forced me to evict Catherine from Windsor Castle to live in much inferior properties, some of which affected her health. But worst of all, she forced me to separate Catherine from our daughter Mary, and Catherine and Mary never saw each other again. Anne Boleyn had 4 pregnancies. She became pregnant quickly, and all the astrologers I consulted, because I used to consult astrologers, all but one of them assured me it would be a boy. And all the baptismal arrangements were made on that basis. All the announcements were made on the basis that it would be a boy. But it was, of course, a girl, Elizabeth, whom I loved dearly. And what a queen she would grow up to be, gentlemen. I realized after her downfall that Anne did not love me. She was in this marriage for political power. She loved wielding political power, and she was haughty and strident. She made enemies at court, and she used to have tantrums at me in public. She used to shout and even scream at me and stamp her feet when I would not do what she thought I should do politically. And so I concluded after her downfall that Anne Boleyn did not love me at all. I come now to the year 1536. Catherine died in January of that year. Your historians say that I had shortened her life by my attack on our marriage. Catherine, if you're looking down on us today, I go down on my bended knees and I beg your forgiveness. You knew that Anne Boleyn had bewitched me, but I simply could not understand it. You were a wonderful wife, Catherine. We had a wonderful marriage for 18 years. Rest in peace, my beloved Catherine. Rest in peace. Oh, and Catherine, thank you heartily for making these wonderful shirts for me. A few days later, I had a dreadful jousting accident. I was apparently unconscious for 2 hours, although that length of time is now doubted by historians. Doctors say that it affected my frontal lobes and that I became a vicious, vengeful, unpredictable, psychopathic tyrant. I know not about that, but I do know that I began to get aches in the head, which I had never had before. And then just a few days later, Anne Boleyn had another miscarriage, and it would have been a boy. She just couldn't carry boys to full term, and that infuriated me. I knew it wasn't my fault because I had sired a mistress. I had sired a baby on my mistress Elizabeth Blount, Henry Fitzroy, whom I later created the Duke of Richmond. So I could father healthy children. Anne couldn't carry boys to full term. And I was angry with her. And she lost her temper at me in a way she had never done before. And I decided that that was the end of my marriage to Anne Boleyn. I wanted my marriage annulled, for I had fallen in love with someone else, Jane Seymour. And I will describe Jane Seymour to you shortly. At this stage, gentlemen, I was not thinking of killing Anne Boleyn. I had no thought whatsoever of that. But one dreadful morning, Thomas Cromwell, my new Chancellor or Chief Minister, visited me with some members of the Privy Council. And Cromwell told me that he had found evidence that Anne Boleyn was committing adultery with 5 men, including her brother George, which would, of course, have been incest. And also, worse than that, they had conspired to kill me. There was a conspiracy to take my life. Your historians say they don't know what my reaction was. I did not believe these charges at first of incest and adultery, but the charge of treason, conspiring against my life, shook me. I had not anticipated that. I thought Anne Boleyn might have had some sort of romance with Norris, one of the men involved. So I told Cromwell to complete his investigations quickly and to return to me. And he had already carried out much investigation. He had examined Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting, and he returned to me to say, yes, I can find evidence for all of these charges. But something even more terrible, gentlemen, than the charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Cromwell whispered in my ear that Anne Boleyn had made fun of my virility in front of other people on several occasions. Gentlemen, as you would say in modern parlance now, from that time on, Anne Boleyn was a dead queen walking. The 5 men and Anne Boleyn were all arrested and taken to the Tower of London. The men, apart from George Boleyn, were put on trial first, then Anne was put on trial, then George Boleyn was put on trial. All of the men were found guilty and were executed by being beheaded. Anne conducted herself brilliantly, apparently, at her trial. There were 21 charges against her, 14 of adultery, 4 of incest, and 3 of treason. But, gentlemen, in order to ensure the efficient administration of justice, I had made it clear to the jury in advance what their verdict would have to be. And it was a unanimous verdict of guilty on all charges. And Anne Boleyn was sentenced to be burned in London or to have her head smitten from her shoulders, as the king's pleasure shall further be known. Gentlemen, I was then assailed by pleas of mercy for Anne. And as you know, I was a merciful king. So I showed mercy to Anne in two ways. Firstly, I agreed that instead of being burned, she could be beheaded. And secondly, I agreed that she could be beheaded by the sword, which would be a cleaner death. And I hired an expert swordsman from France, from Calais. So, gentlemen, you don't think much of my mercy? Let me tell you this, that French swordsman cost me in today's money £7,800. As you know, I never attended executions. I'm told that Anne Boleyn was kneeling on the scaffold blindfolded, not knowing what was happening. And the French swordsman took off his boots, crept up behind her and sliced off her head with one stroke. But gentlemen, now that I am back in the world, I am deeply troubled. Almost all of your historians say that these charges were trumped up political charges, trumped up by Cromwell, who hated Anne Boleyn, who had been threatened with death by Anne Boleyn, and who decided to strike before he was struck. And I am deeply troubled about that. I am also deeply troubled about the charges of incest, because the only witness to those charges was Jane Rochford, George Boleyn's estranged wife. The two of them hated each other, and she was jealous of her brother's relationship with his sister. And some years later, when Jane Rochford was on the scaffold about to be executed for having facilitated adultery by my wife-to-be, Catherine Howard, Jane Rochford admitted that her evidence about the incest was a pack of lies. And that deeply troubles me, gentlemen, that Anne Boleyn and these 5 men died when they should not have died. It was a monstrous miscarriage of justice. I come now to Jane Seymour. Some of your historians have failed to realize that my interest in Jane was not at first romantic. It was simply that she came from fertile stock. She had 10 brothers and sisters. And I thought it was much more likely that if I married her, she would be able to present me with a male heir. Jane was the exact opposite of Anne Boleyn. She was a dutiful wife, an obedient wife. She was shy and demure and hardly spoke unless she was spoken to. Although it has to be said, she was feisty at times and could speak up for herself. I knew that it would be unseemly for me to become betrothed to Jane on the very day that Anne Boleyn was executed at the Tower of London. I knew that. So I waited until the next day and we were betrothed. And we were married 10 days later. Jane knew I had made her the Queen of England to produce a male heir. I loved little Jane Seymour dearly, gentlemen. I'm often asked, which of your wives did you love the most? I cannot choose between Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour. I dearly loved little Jane. She made one mistake. She tried to interfere with politics. She tried to get me to restore some of the monasteries that were dissolved as part of the Reformation. And I turned on her one day and warned her not to do it again and to remember what had happened to Anne Boleyn. Gentlemen, how could I have done that? I was saying to my wife, if you do this again, I will kill you. However, worry not, I made up to Jane afterwards. I loved little Jane Seymour dearly. And then she fulfilled my ambition. She gave birth to Edward, and at last I had a son. And I can assure you, gentlemen, I rejoiced and rejoiced and rejoiced, you would say parted today, in a way that I had never rejoiced before. But 12 days later, tragedy struck. My little Jane died. At first, it was thought to have been a puerperal fever, but doctors today think she had a heart attack after suffering acute food poisoning. And I wept and wept and wept. I wept for Jane Seymour in a way I'd never wept for any woman before, apart from my mother. It took me 2 years to get over the death of little Jane. Meanwhile, I had left politics to Cromwell, my chief minister, and he was pursuing a treaty with the Germanic princes to counterbalance the new alliance between the Holy Roman Emperor and the King of France. And there was a Germanic prince, the Duke of Cleves, who had 2 sisters. He was a Protestant prince. He had 2 sisters, Anne and Amelia. And Cromwell suggested that I might like to marry one of these sisters. Well, gentlemen, I'm a man of the world. I had seen all of the wives I'd married. I did not really countenance marrying a woman I had not seen. But the solution was to send Hans Holbein, the court portrait painter, to Germany to paint miniatures of these 2 sisters. And when I saw these miniatures, I thought Anne was the more comely of the 2. And it was here, gentlemen, that Cromwell and I made a dreadful mistake, which I now admit. I should have insisted that Anne come to England for a viewing so that I could see her and tell whether I wanted to marry her. But I didn't. And Cromwell also made a mistake which proved fatal for him. He did not put wording in the treaty which would entitle me to decline to proceed with the marriage if I so chose to do so. And so I agreed to marry Anne of Cleves. What was she like? She was tall, she was intelligent, she wasn't well read, she wasn't well versed in intellectual matters, and she didn't have many graces. She couldn't sing or dance, and she could not speak one word of English, but she made the long journey from Germany to England. And I had been told that she was so beautiful. I kept getting reassurance from Cromwell about how beautiful a woman she was, that I couldn't wait to see her. So I burst in on her a day before she was expecting me. She apparently thought I was some fat, drunken old fool who had entered the wrong room. And I had expected to behold beauty, but what I beheld was repulsive. She was pear-shaped, and I don't like pear-shaped women. She had an enormous bosom, and I don't like that either. And she had a body stink, a body odor, the like of which we had never experienced at court. You knew Anne of Cleves had been in a room about 2 hours after she had left it. Each of us withdrew from that meeting in some confusion. Your historians have called it history's worst blind date, but it was more than a blind date, gentlemen. It was a blind marriage for me. When I next saw Cromwell, do you know what he said to me? He said, "How like ye the Lady Anne, sire?" I turned on him. I said, "I like her not. I like her not. I like her not, Thomas. God's blood, Thomas. I'm not going to marry a pear-shaped woman with a huge bosom and a body stink. You got me into this nightmare. You get me out." And I boxed his ears for him, which I was wont to do when I was in a temper, and he fled from my presence. But he had to return to me to say he had put no wording in the treaty which would entitle me not to go ahead with the marriage. And once again, he fled from my presence. And so, gentlemen, You can imagine the turmoil I was in. I had to proceed with the marriage. I couldn't consummate it. I will spare you the details. And then I turned against Cromwell. This was all his fault. I would not be going through this nightmare but for him. He had assured me she was a beautiful woman. And his enemies at court now circled round like sharks, and they turned against him. He was charged with ridiculous charges of treason and heresy and taken to the Tower of London. In his last letter to me from the Tower of London, he added a postscript saying, "I cry for mercy, mercy, mercy." But gentlemen, I showed him no mercy, and he was beheaded at the Tower of London. Thomas, if you are looking down on us today, I beg your forgiveness. You knew what I was like, Thomas, when I was in a rage. You were the best chief minister I ever had, Thomas. I told the Privy Council they were all fools and idiots compared to you. If I could have stuck your head back on, Thomas, and brought you back to life, I would have done so. Rest in peace, Thomas Cromwell, my best of chief ministers. I then negotiated a divorce, technically an annulment, with Anne of Cleves, who turned out to be a very shrewd lady. She stayed on in England. I gave her pots of cash, several houses which were like little palaces, and I agreed that she would be treated as my sister, which meant that she would take precedence over every other woman in England, apart from any future queen. And she and I became the best of friends. She learned to speak English fluently, and she lost her body stink. I asked one of my gentlemen of the bedchamber about that, and he said she had obtained a potion from an apothecary, a chemist, a man called Boots. Anne of Cleves became the best friend, gentlemen, I had ever had. She was kind to my children in particular. She had lots of common sense. She was wonderful to be with, and she had a wonderful sense of humor. Anne of Cleves could make me laugh my head off, and I needed to be able to laugh to distract me from the affairs of state. While I was negotiating this divorce, my eye fell upon my next wife, Catherine Howard. Gentlemen, I just cannot describe to you what Catherine Howard was like. She restored my faith and my virility. She was only 19 years of age. She had a beautiful figure, the kind I liked, and she was vivacious, flirtatious, very much aware of the effect she had on men. Unfortunately for her, and fatally for her, she wasn't very intelligent and could hardly read or write, but I didn't care about that at the time. Some of your historians think it was love on my part, but gentlemen, I confess to you, it was lust, pure lust, although I did become fond of Catherine as our marriage went on. I showered her with jewels. She loved jewels. Perhaps she thought that she didn't have long to tolerate me, and that when I died, she would get even more jewels. Catherine and I went on a progress to the north of England, to Yorkshire, having separate sleeping quarters, of course. And she was kind to my daughters. Everything was going well in the marriage until one morning I returned from my religious devotions to find that Thomas Cranmer, my Archbishop of Canterbury, had left a letter for me. It contained information so explosive that the man was terrified to tell me to my face. Would you like to know what this letter said, gentlemen? It said that my beloved Catherine, when she was in an aristocratic boarding school a few years earlier, had lost her virginity to a man called Derham. and I thought I had married a virgin. I was sore amazed, and I told Cranmer to ask Catherine about it, and she freely admitted it. And then I thought, well, what of it? It happened before I even knew her. But then I was given even more terrible information. While Catherine and I were on that progress in the north of England, she had met her lover, Thomas Culpeper, on several occasions at night. And I went into a fury, a jealous rage, the kind of which I had never experienced before. I had Culpeper and Derham arrested. They were tortured on the rack. Culpeper admitted that he had met Catherine with the intention of having intercourse with her, but nothing actually happened. However, the intention was enough. That was treason. And he was accused of treason and beheaded. Derham, would you believe, refused to confess under the rack. He said that he had never had intercourse with my wife since the date on which she married me. But I have turned against Derham. There will be no merciful death for him. He died a traitor's death. And I'll just explain that to you. He was dragged on a sort of sledge from the Tower of London to Tyburn. He was strung up on a gibbet, but cut down before he was dead. He was stripped of his clothes, naked. He was strapped to a trestle table. And then the executioner castrated him and then slit him open, pulled out his innards and set them on fire in front of him. Then he was beheaded and his body cut into 4 parts and nailed up in parts of London. Now, gentlemen, I'm sure you think that was a cruel way to execute Derham. Of course it was cruel. We had to be cruel in those days in the way we executed traitors. Otherwise, there would have been a lot more treason. And on the subject of treason, gentlemen, while I think about it, this queen of yours, Queen Elizabeth II, 94 years of age, a lady for whom I have the most tremendous respect, and her chief minister, this man Johnstone, with the yellow hair which he appears never to comb, neither of them has the constitutional right to have any of you gentlemen taken to the Tower of London and executed. They just could not do it. And what is more, did you know, gentlemen, that under the Human Rights Act 1998, passed by the Westminster Parliament, each of you gentlemen has an inalienable right, a human right to happiness. A human right to happiness. I used to worry about what would happen to my kingdom after my death, and all I can say is they've made a pig's arse of it. I'm coming now to Catherine. She denied everything, and here we had a legal difficulty. The lawyers told me that the fact that Culpeper intended to meet her in the night to have intercourse with her did not, as a matter of law, mean that she would consent. So this was a problem, but it was solved by the lawyers. You will find this solution beautiful, gentlemen. Listen to this. The Act of Parliament, the Act of Attainder, which accused her of treason, said that it was the law of England and had always been the law of England, which it hadn't really, but it was the law of England and had always been the law of England that if a loose-living woman failed to disclose her past to the king when she agreed to marry him, she was guilty of treason. And so retrospectively, Catherine was found guilty of treason, even though that really wasn't the law at the time when she agreed to marry me. Is that not beautiful, gentlemen? Lawyers can be expensive at times, gentlemen, but by God, they can also be useful. I must admit to having been in two minds about executing Catherine, but matters were taken out of my hand. I could see no way to making an exception for her. Anne Boleyn had been executed for treason, and so Catherine Howard was also executed for treason. I'm told she died bravely on the block, on the scaffold. Well, gentlemen, as you can imagine, by this time I was weary of marriage, but I still craved female company. And my eye fell upon my last wife, Catherine Parr, in her early 30s, twice widowed. A beautiful woman. Some of your historians think that she was not much to look at, if I can put it that way, but she was a beautiful, mature woman. I should explain to you my medical condition at this time. I freely admit to having indulged in gluttony. I used to have a plate of custard tarts first thing in the morning and then another plate last thing at night. Some of my meals apparently consisted of 36 different dishes, according to your historians, but I never counted them. But it is said I weighed 28 stone at this time. And I also had a dreadful ulcer in my leg from that jousting accident. It used to ooze pus and poison. It used to stink. And you know what my doctor, Dr. Butts, used to pour into the ulcer? Lemon juice. And when I roared my head off in pain, he gave me a draught which made me only half conscious. So at this time of my reign, much of the time I was in acute pain and I was only half conscious. I knew that Catherine Parr could never love me. I never loved her. We were just easy with each other. My proposal of marriage took her by surprise. She said she needed time to think. And then apparently she was told by God to marry me so she could promote the new gospel religion. And we were married. And it was a happy marriage for a time. I even made her regent of England when I went abroad to fight the French. But then Catherine made mistakes. She wrote a book called Lamentation of a Sinner in English about religion, which infuriated me because I had allowed books about religion to be written in English only to be considered among families, not to be jangled in every alehouse in England. And she also argued with me about religion. And I thought one day, God's blood, this is like being married to Anne Boleyn again. I am not having this. And my new chancellor, a man called Risley, a man whom I detested, by the by, was with me one day and persuaded me that Catherine had committed treason by writing that book and by having these evangelical Protestant views. And I agreed with him that he should come to the palace garden the following day with soldiers to arrest Catherine and take her to the Tower of London so that she could be charged with treason and beheaded. But after Risley had left me, I thought that I could not proceed to have wife number 3 executed. So I resolved that if Catherine was submissive to me and apologized to me, and as long as I was satisfied she wouldn't do it again, I would forgive her. So the following day in the palace garden, I confronted her. I can still see her now. She was so terrified she had to sit down. Her legs gave way. And I asked her why she had written this book, why she had argued with me about religion. So she said that, oh, well, I argued with you simply to get the benefit of your wonderful learning. I love hearing you speak about religion, and also to take your mind off the pain in your ulcer. Was she lying? Of course she was lying. I suppose you could say, gentlemen, she was lying her head off to prevent it from being cut off. But I decided to forgive her. And I said to her, Even as that so sweetheart, then we are perfect friends again. I cannot describe to you the look of relief which came across her face. And at that point, Risley comes running into the garden with soldiers and knelt before me, expecting me to tell him to arrest Catherine. And I shouted at him, arrant knave, beast, fool, and he had to flee from my presence. I died in 1547, survived by Catherine Parr, and at my own request, I was buried in the royal vault in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle beside my entirely beloved wife, Jane Seymour. But enough of my marriages, gentlemen. I now want to tell you why I deserve to be remembered as the greatest king England ever had. I was the best educated king England ever had. I had a huge library of books. I was interested in new learning. I could converse with philosophers about a whole range of subjects: mathematics, astrology, theology. I created the most glittering royal court in Europe. All the aristocracy wanted to be at my royal court. I had great personal gifts. I was musical. I could sing, compose music, play musical instruments. And when I made speeches about religion, I could reduce people to tears. And most important of all, please remember the time I spent on building up the English Navy. I spent a huge amount of my reign on naval matters. When I became king, England only had 5 ships. When I died, it had 50 ships. And had it not been for me, the Spanish Armada of 1588 would never have been defeated. I had a great love of architecture. I left some wonderful palaces. Have you ever visited Hampton Palace in London? And I fortified England against the threat of invasion. I always had the security of my kingdom foremost in my mind. And so, gentlemen, for all of these reasons, I wish you to go forth, tell your families and everyone you know about the greatness of Henry VIII of England, so that my soul can leave this man's body and return to the royal vault in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle to rest in everlasting peace beside my entirely beloved wife, little Jane Seymour. Gentlemen, in conclusion, I thank you heartily for your attendance upon me today, and I bid you good day. Thank you very much.
Every word is true, of course. We've got to agree with that. I don't want to go to the Tower. So it's a case of, gentlemen, any questions to ask Roy? Anyone not believe what he said? Okay, Bruce. Bruce, I see you.
No, I found that a tour de force. It was fascinating, but I'm afraid if I was in line of duty, I would have found that not an apologia, but an absolute incrimination. You are an arrogant and an oligarch, I would suggest. But as a historian, it was wonderful. And you're right, you just used the facts in the way you wanted to use them, but it was really interesting. Henry VIII and Elizabeth, I've always believed they didn't really get on very well.
You mean his daughter?
Yes, his daughter.
Well, no, I think that he loved both his daughters dearly. He had a huge problem with Mary, of course, because of her disobedience.
Yeah, he declared Elizabeth illegitimate, and
yes, he did, and Mary too, so that Edward could be first in succession. You see, yes. I didn't mention
that was fantastic, John. As you know, I've got to dash. I'm off to a meeting in town, which is why I'm here with a shirt and tie. Thank you very much, Roy. It was really, really good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I couldn't help but sit here and listen to that wonderful, wonderful speech and view what it'd be like in about 30 years' time for the ex-president of the United States for you to do exactly the same thing.
That was absolutely great. And I mean, you didn't hold back when you said, I was really enthralled with your statements. You said she didn't make a pig's arse of it instead of a pig's ear of it. I thought, God, this man has really let it go. Well done. I certainly enjoyed it. It's one of the best things I've ever witnessed. I was laughing out loud.
George?
Hi, Roy. You did actually refer to the modern day man with yellow hair, Boris, and his not First Minister, but his private confidant, Cummings, is about to give evidence to Parliament. I don't think Cummings is going to lose his head, but he's free because of today's democracy to let rip with all the inside information. And it's interesting to see how mad Boris goes. And I'm sure, I think that the public will also have their view whether Boris's head should fall. But fortunately, we live in enlightened times, shall we say.
It will be interesting to see.
Do you think Dominic Cummings will be able to actually see the committee? I understand his eyesight's a bit dodgy.
If it goes off to Barnard Castle.
Very good.
I think on a scale of 100, his credibility rating is probably 0.
In modern day parlance, a lot of problems, if you like, with marriages and all the rest of it, our kids are blamed on how they're brought up and what the influence the parents have. Was Henry's father a problem? Like, you didn't guide him at all, and you know, the little bit I heard was it was all geared for his brother, obviously, to become the king, and Henry was kind of neglected. Does that manifest itself? You know, that he was wanting to.
It's very difficult, of course, to compare Henry's situation vis-a-vis his father with any with our modern families today. His father was a peculiar man in many ways. I don't think he showed much in the way of fraternal love towards Henry, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
And Henry was brought up among women, among his sister and other women. And I think that probably meant Henry was spoiled, which did influence the way he acted later on. Yes.
Listen, Roy, thank you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that, Roy, and I hope you'll come back to give us another talk when we get back to meeting person to person, hopefully in the Rose Club from September.
It's delighted to do that. Yes, thank you.
Love to have you. I just also like to take this opportunity, since it's our last meeting of the year, to thank a couple of people. I'd like to thank John in particular for all the time and effort and expertise that he's put in to keeping the Zoom meetings going. We owe you a real debt of gratitude, John. And also like to thank Chris for keeping us so well informed throughout the past 15 months or so. So thanks to them both.
Well done.
Yeah.
Well, to wrap it up then, I think we've done absolutely brilliant this session. I've just noticed it, I wrote them all down, by the way. All the meetings we've had, 28 in total.
Brilliant.
And there's so many that it covers all over the world, actually. Fascinating. And because we normally get our, you know, we get this program, it tells you what's on. And I thought, well, I'm going to keep a record of this. So if anyone wants a copy of that, all the speakers, I can send it on or send it by email. But it's been a fantastic year of speakers, and the finale, as I say, the best actor is Roy Johnstone.
I think, you know, half truths. From the point of view of a heritable record, all of these talks, all 28 of them, or 27 actually, because one of our speakers didn't want to be left for posterity. But 27 out of the 28 talks are available on the Probus channel on YouTube, so you can in fact go and reminisce and look at them again anytime you want. Roy, your one was absolutely excellent, really enjoyed it. and it should be up by tomorrow, hopefully, or if not tomorrow, certainly by Friday. And I'll send you a link to it when that's happened. I have to do a wee bit of editing beforehand. I've enjoyed doing this. It's given me something to do. It's given me an interest. So, you know, thanks for your thanks, but it's been a pleasure doing it. I've learned an awful lot about how to do Zoom meetings, which I didn't know about before. And I've learned a great deal about video editing as well, because taking out the warty bits is quite tricky sometimes. So I'll see you all in September. Bruce Jameson is going to do us another talk, I think in October probably. He's on holiday in September, and we're hoping that it's going to be a face-to-face one. And the committee will obviously try and get some speakers lined up. But I really do sincerely hope that we meet again properly in September. If we don't, then Zoom will happen again, but we're off for our summer holidays now. So I'll see you all in the course of things, but certainly by September. So cheerio, everybody, and thanks again.
Bye-bye.